So welcome to the Flipped Classroom Workshops Flipped Classroom video. I know that's kind of meta, but I thought I would try to get some of the information out there before we actually meet, because I want to make the actual time that we meet on September 30th at in room 711 AAC more of a workshop, more of a hands-on workshop where we are able to actually try things. And in order to do that, we only have an hour and a half. So in order to do that, we're going to have to go over some of the material first here. And so I'm going to make a bunch of short videos that'll help you with that. So what is a flipped classroom? We're first going to go over the anatomy of a flipped classroom. And the traditional classroom is going to have a lecture that's given, and then at home the student takes home a bunch of homework problems that they need to do. And what makes a flipped classroom flipped is that you actually do the lecture at home, and while you're in class you do the problem sets. And so that's where the flipped part comes into play. And the reason why this is important is because lectures tend to be more of a passive medium where the instructor is giving information out and the students passively absorb it. Whereas problem sets have the ability to be interactive if we are there to help them do that. So if we capitalize that and say the passive medium should be done in a more passive medium, right? So you can do that with video that student can watch at home. And the benefit of this is that students have the ability to pause. If there's something that they don't understand, they can go back and watch it again. If there's something that they totally do understand, then they can skip that and move on to the next section. Then when you get to class, you apply that information and you apply it with your other fellow students and with the instructor acting as a coach. And so you're using the time that we have with the expert, that is the instructor, in a more interactive way. So let me give you an example of how I've used it. So here I've depicted a video on ischemic stroke. So I would tell my students, go ahead and watch some stroke videos at home. And then when you get to class, we're going to go through some cases of actual stroke patients and then use the material that you learned on the video and apply it. Now, the flipped classroom is nothing new, really. Since the dawn of medicine, I think a physician would ask their students, why don't you go ahead and read this article and then we'll talk about it tomorrow. And that's basically kind of what the flipped classroom is. But the introduction of all this new technology makes this a lot more interactive and a lot more engaging. And so with streaming video such as YouTube and Vimeo and Panopto, we can actually put these lectures up in a very interactive fashion. And we have other things that we can do in class like high fidelity simulation. So there are also a lot of people who are making material out there already. Of course, we all know about the Khan Academy, and they have a whole medical series which is put on by Rishi Desai, who's actually now, I believe, a resident, or he may have graduated already, who works with Sal Khan in order to make the various videos. And there's other people, other amateurs like this gentleman here from FTP Lectures, who just stands in front of a dry erase board and explains things. But he's a very dynamic teacher, and so he's very popular. There are things like this, which is handwrittentutorials.com, where this guy draws with a Sharpie marker and narrates over what he's drawing. And finally, there are even podcasts like the one by Dr. Ali R. Jalali from Toronto, or from Ottawa, I'm sorry, for anatomy lectures. So is there really any evidence that shows that flipping works? And there's really one major study that came out of Science in 2011 by Delorius, Schlew, and Wieman. And it was a physics class at the University of British Columbia. The class was taught by a celebrated professor and usually had 800 or so students in it. And it was broken up into sections. And so they took one of those sections, which was the electromagnetism section, and they split the class into two groups. One group had the traditional lecture with that celebrated professor lecturing to them, and then they would just take problem sets and do them at home. The other group, the other half of the class, had a flipped class, so they were asked to read about how to do the problems, and when they came to class, they worked in small groups to do the problem sets with teaching assistants walking around and helping the students out. And so here are some examples of what these problems looked like. I have no idea what the answers to these are. I'm sure they're very complex. Okay, and so here is the table 1 from that article, and you could see that the groups, the control group and the experimental group, were fairly similar in their ability and size when they started. And at the end, they looked at a couple of different things. They looked at the attendance, and you could see the attendance in the experimental section was much higher. It increased from 57 to 75, whereas you can see that the attendance from the control group didn't really change. And same with the engagement, whereas you can see the engagement here was much bigger. But these are really, I would say, softer outcomes. The bigger outcome is how did they do on their test. And the red represents here the experimental group. They did a 12-question test at the end of this week of electricity and magnetism. And you can see that most students actually got almost all of them right, whereas in the control group, the most students got about half of them right, less than half of them right. And this, I want to say, is that the experimental group didn't even complete all of the material that the control group did, and yet they did so much better. I actually went and looked in the literature myself just to see, is there anything in medicine or healthcare that we can find. And in July, I tried to find all the articles I could of using healthcare, flipped classroom, and education, and I found 59 articles at that time. And so here's what I found: that there were, most of them talked about student perceptions, 20 of them, and most of them said students thought it was better to flip the classroom, but some of them didn't like it. A lot of them were just reviews or innovations describing the innovation that they had. 16 of them looked at test scores, and most of them showed that students actually did better, though some of them were kind of weak arguments. And finally, one of them looked at the cost and said that the cost of flipping is actually very expensive. It takes a lot of resources. And so let me give you my 2 cents on this. So I think that the flipped classroom is it's new, and it's in fashion right now because it's a new way of teaching, and we get to use the new technologies that are available to us. But it's really nothing that hasn't been there before. We've actually flipped our evidence-based medicine classroom, and I can also attest to the fact that it is expensive to do it. It took me and Dr. Beth Lynch a long time to make all those videos and to design the materials. However, we saw a huge jump in the students' scores on the biostatistics and epidemiology portions of USMLE Step 1 since we started doing this. And they seem to really like the fact that this flipped classroom method, because they're able to go at it at their own speed. We had some students who had no biostatistics and others who did a major in biostatistics. Each one was able to take the material at their own pace without having to slow down anyone else or rush through the material. Okay, that's this first video. I'll put up another one later, and thanks.